Hello, welcome. You are listening to Dr. Sushma Singh today in Unit 9, Verrier, Elwin and G.S. Guryev's perspective on tribe. Let us continue our topic, the framing of tribal question, Elwin and Guryev. Tribal forest dwellers and other communities have been part of contiguous geographical space, and their interaction has enriched the civilization culture of the subcontinent. For instance, the cult of the mother goddess and of the Shiva was enriched, and knowledge of medicinal plants was gathered and compiled. With the historical beginning of Hinduism in medieval India, there emerged a notion of ritual hierarchy between man and God, between individual and collective, between self and society, between being in the world and being in the presence of God, between reason and religious belief. The hierarchy was a feature of sedentary agricultural communities amongst both Hindu and Muslims. Tribal societies, in contrast, were pastoral and nomadic in their movement. The nature and frequency of interaction between them was not frequent. The sedentary and pastoral people were distributed over three different kinds of human settlements: the plains, the cities and towns, and the forest. In the plains and in the cities dwelt the Muslims and the Hindus, and in the forest lived the tribal people. There was no notion of the centers and the frontiers. There was no notion either of dominant and the mainstream, nor the marginal and the peripheral. The latter notion developed on account of colonialism. The natural science methodologies were mechanically adopted by the social sciences. For instance, this led to anthropology, establishing its claim to be regarded as a study which has an immediate practical value in connection with the administration and education of backward people. This raised the question, what sort of anthropological investigations are of practical value in connection with such problems of administration? What is the historical and functional interpretation of culture in relation to the practical application of anthropology to the control of native peoples? Colonial rule, in conformity with this thinking, compared forest dwellers in India with the aborigines in Australia, Africa and the Pacific Islands, and were described as backward, primitive and uncivilized tribal people. After India became independent, this colonial understanding continued the debates and discussions in the center. Nehru's Panchsheel was formulated around this understanding. It stays with us even today. These discontinuities have so far been arranged and understood in the framework of linear historical development and in conformity with the normative order of industrial production. Accordingly, social formations progress from simple to complex, from primitive to modern technologies, from savage to the civilized social life, and from irrational to rational and reasonable modes of thinking and codes of conduct. Now let us move to the next point, that is a history of the tribal voice. There is another way of understanding the tribal situation. They were the first to protest against British encroachment into their life. There were two important consequences of these long years of resistance to pressures from the Hindus and Christians, and from the state to adopt their development program. A class structure developed within the tribal people. Guryev's class differentiation can be read to understand the different responses to the non-tribal world and how the state evolved its instruments of governance. The first class of tribal, like the Rajgons and others, joined the mainstream and were assimilated. They got recognized as a member of a fairly high status within mainstream society and have had a tendency toward revivalism and preservations. They over time became the tribal elite. In contrast, the third class, the hill section, according to Guryev, exhibited the greatest power of resistance to alien culture that have pressed upon their borders and were marginalized. Today they dwell in the deep forest and continue to practice shifting cultivation, for instance. In Abu Jamara in Bastar, Madhya Pradesh, in Koraput and Fulbani in Orissa. The large mass of second-class tribal peoples, some Hindu and some Christian, suffered from development. A majority of them are middle class with the little or no land. A large number became poor. A brief history of the development of state instruments of governance begins when the East India Company established its first factory in 1651. A florist trade soon developed. Until 1757, the year of the Battle of Plassey, India went on receiving silver supplies on an increasing scale, but now these companies' treasure exported in 1750 amounted to 1.10 million, but now these stopped together as the English company financed its purchases from revenue raised from here. In 1765 they acquired from the Mughals the right of Diwani, mean revenue collection in Bengal. 4 years later, the Bengal famine of 1769 to 70 destroyed one-third of the population, including artisans and cultivators, and the one-third of the land was rendered waste. This hurried on the financial crisis of 1772, which led to the state interference in the company's affair. Warren Hastings came to India in 1772 as Governor General. In 1773, the Parliament passed Regulating Act, which helped the company avert bankruptcy, and a council was formed to assist him. He was to deal with the situation created by a generation of rapacious company servants known as the Civil Clive generation, who in search of quick profit has unabashedly ravaged Bengal and left the once fertile province a confused heap as wild as the chaos itself. He developed a cultural policy aimed at creating an orientalized service elite, competent in Indian languages and responsive to Indian traditions, not only at the level of social intercourse but also on that of intellectual exchange. That is Indian culture as the basis of sound Indian administration, as Percival Spear said. In this year, the first contact with the tribal people was also made with Captain Kamek, an officer of the company's army, exchanged turbans with the rulers of Chota Nagpur, who acknowledged the scrutiny of the British. This step was taken to lay down a strong cultural intellectual foundation for governance. It led to the setting of Asiatic Society of Bengal in 1784 to 1838 and later College Fort William in 1800 to 1813. The former promoted research in the area of Indology and the later introduced university education. The education system created a middle class that was utilized by the British to run the administration. The Asiatic Society prepared the ground for research and writing the settlements reports that were the basis for settling tax. The people who benefited were people of the reading and writing tradition, the twice-born caste Hindu and the rich Muslim. A large section of population who were people of the oral tradition, the occupational caste, were excluded. These steps were taken to overcome the crisis resulted in formulation of the intellectual cultural framework for the states to position and interpret the tribal voices that were expressed through their struggles that followed. After the formulation of the cultural policy, the Parihars revolted in 1778 against the company's attempt at charting a postal route, which was viewed by them as an act of encroachment. This was followed by the Koli disturbance and the revolt in Tamar of Chota Nagpur. To earn revenue, the British undertook land and revenue settlements in the form of Permanent Settlement 1793. It transformed subsistence agriculture into commercial agriculture for growing cotton and indigo for textile mills in Manchester. Thereafter, there were at least 40 recorded events of confrontation, acts of minor protest and major revolts by tribal people in different parts of India until 1857, which was the year of the Great Santhal Rebellion in 1857 and the Indian Mutiny. The state responded on the one hand with the separate Santhal district prohibition of intermediaries between the Santhals and the government, abolition of the community-bounded labor system, and on the other by formulating the Queen's Proclamation of 1858, which granted each community a right to its own culture, obvious of bilingual attributes that is the history of interaction between communities. It defined non-interference with regard to cultural differences as the principle of governance. It was stated, all people in India shall alike enjoy the equal and impartial protection of law. All subjects of whatever caste, tribe, race and creed shall be freely and impartially admitted to offices in British services. In framing and administrating the law, due regard will be paid to the ancient rights, usages and the custom of people belonging to different castes, tribes and races in India, and The British government will not interfere with the religious belief or worship of any of the British subjects. This was the first political expression of the cultural policy. The underlying social theory on diversity can be read from the 1880s book on India. There is not and never was an India or even a country like India possessing, according to European ideas, any sort of unity, physical, political, social or religious. There were only natural regions that people of these regions should ever think of themselves as Indian, that they should feel they belong to one great nation. It was further said India was a creation of the British imperial power and that it was essentially artificial with its existence dependent on careful exercise of power. It laid the framework for a mode of self-determination, one that was not possible without state patronage. Between 1858 and 1935, there were 28 recorded events of confrontations. During this period, the Forest Act 1858 created reserved forest and forest villages were allowed within the reserved areas. By 1895, several forest villages were established. The Acquisition Act 1894 prepared the ground for the next stage. The stopping and shifting began in 1890 when the forest village regulations were issued. There was compensation for the land taken over by state. By 1895, the permanence of these villages was sufficiently established to settle them as royalty tracts. Various orders that were passed for ameliorating the condition of tribals of the East Godavari Agency population were ultimately consolidated in law known as the Agency Tract Interest and Land Transfer Act 1917. It formed a model for similar legislation in other tribal areas. The most important feature of this act was that it restricted transfer of land from tribal to outsiders. Here we want to close this lecture. Thanks for listening.